The silence of Montana's Bighorn Valley was broken only by the gentle rush of water over stones and the occasional call of a night bird. But for 3 weeks straight, another sound had been cutting through the darkness, the desperate, haunting bark of a dog that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell itself. Tom Henderson, a weathered rancher who had spent 47 years working this land, had heard every kind of animal cry imaginable, but nothing had ever chilled his blood quite like this. The sound wasn't just loud, it was wrong, carrying a note of terror that made his horses shy away from the pasture nearest the old stone bridge. What started as an annoyance had become something far more disturbing. Every single night at exactly 11:43, the barking would begin. Not the normal bark of a dog chasing rabbits or warning of strangers, but something desperate, pleading, almost human in its anguish. Tom's own border collie, Rex, would whimper and hide under the porch whenever the sound started, refusing to come out until dawn broke over the distant crazy mountains. The other ranchers in the area had begun talking about it too. Jake Morrison from the spread upstream, Sarah Chun who ran cattle on the eastern boundary, even old Pete Kowalski whose family had worked this valley since the 1890s. None of them had ever heard anything like it. But here's what made Tom's skin crawl. He had walked every inch of his property during daylight hours, searching for any sign of a dog, any trace of an animal that could be making that sound. Nothing. No tracks in the soft earth near the riverbank, no droppings, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that any living creature had been anywhere near that bridge. The local sheriff, Deputy Maria Santos, had even brought out tracking dogs from Billings, but they had refused to cross the bridge, backing away with their tails between their legs and that same terrified whimper that Rex made every night. The bridge itself was a relic from another era, hand-cut limestone blocks laid by German immigrants in 1887, built to last centuries. It spanned Miller's Creek where the water ran deepest, about 30 feet across and sturdy enough that loaded cattle trucks still used it regularly. Tom's grandfather had told him stories about that bridge, about how the German stonemasons who built it had insisted on working only during daylight hours, refusing to explain why. Local Crow tribe members had avoided the area long before any bridge existed there, though the old-timers who might have known the reasons were long gone. The barking was getting worse. What had started as a few minutes of desperate crying had stretched to nearly an hour of non-stop wailing that seemed to come from directly beneath the bridge's center span. Tom found himself lying awake every night, waiting for that terrible sound, his heart racing even before it began. His wife Martha had started taking sleeping pills just to get through the night, and their teenage daughter Emma refused to come home after dark, choosing to stay at friends' houses rather than face another night of that supernatural howling. 3 nights ago, something had changed. The barking had been joined by another sound, a low, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across stone. Tom had grabbed his most powerful flashlight and headed down to the bridge, but the moment his boots touched the limestone, both sounds had stopped completely. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, thick and expectant, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. When he aimed his light down into the water below, all he could see were the usual creek stones and the occasional flash of a startled trout. But yesterday morning had brought the discovery that changed everything. Emma, brave despite her fear, had gone down to the creek bed during broad daylight to search for answers her father couldn't find. What she discovered beneath the bridge's eastern foundation would explain everything, and create a mystery far more terrifying than a phantom dog. Wedged between 2 of the massive limestone blocks, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox. The lock had long since corroded away, and inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades of moisture, was a collection of items that made Emma's blood run cold. First was a leather journal, its pages yellow and brittle but still readable, written in careful German script that Emma recognized from her high school foreign language classes. The entries were dated 1887, written by someone named Klaus Weber, and as Emma slowly translated the faded ink, a story began to emerge that explained not just the barking, but why the local Crow had avoided this place, why the German workers had refused to work at night, and why no living dog could be found despite weeks of searching. Klaus Weber had been the master stonemason in charge of the bridge construction, a skilled craftsman who had immigrated from Bavaria with his wife and young son. But Klaus had a secret. He was being blackmailed by the railroad company that had commissioned the bridge. They knew about his past, about the accident at his previous job that had killed 3 workers due to his negligence with explosives. If he didn't complete this bridge ahead of schedule and under budget, they would expose him, destroy his reputation, and see him charged with those deaths back east. So Klaus had cut corners. Instead of properly reinforcing the foundation as his engineering plans required, he had used substandard mortar and filled hollow spaces with rubble instead of solid stone. The bridge would hold for normal traffic, but Klaus knew it was fundamentally unsound. What he didn't know was that his shortcuts would claim their first victim before the construction was even complete. The journal's most disturbing entry was dated September 15, 1887. Klaus wrote about his work dog, a German shepherd named Blitz who had been his constant companion since his wife and son had died of cholera during the journey west. Blitz had an uncanny ability to sense structural weaknesses in stone, often whimpering and barking at sections that would later prove unstable. On that September evening, as Klaus worked alone to finish the bridge's eastern foundation, Blitz had become increasingly agitated, barking frantically at the section Klaus was completing with his substandard materials. Frustrated and exhausted, Klaus had ordered Blitz to be quiet, but the dog had continued his warnings. In a moment of rage and desperation, Klaus had struck the animal with a heavy stone, intending only to silence him. But the blow had been harder than intended, and Blitz had fallen unconscious into the partially completed foundation. Instead of pulling the dog out, Klaus had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He sealed Blitz into the foundation, alive but unconscious, telling himself the dog would die quickly and quietly. But Blitz had not died quickly. Klaus's final journal entries described 3 nights of agonized barking coming from within the bridge itself, growing weaker each day until finally falling silent. Klaus had tried to break through the stone to free the dog, but the mortar had already set, and his attempts only weakened the structure further. Consumed by guilt and hearing Phantom barking every night, Klaus had thrown himself from the completed bridge just 1 week after its dedication ceremony. The journal explained the barking, but Emma's discovery was far from over. Beneath the journal were other items, a tarnished silver collar tag engraved with Blitz K. Weber, 1886, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be dog treats turned to powder over the decades, and most disturbing of all, a set of architect's plans that showed the exact location where Klaus had entombed the living animal. But the final item in the box changed everything Emma thought she understood about the situation. It was a letter, written in English and dated just 6 months ago, addressed to whoever finds this box. The handwriting was shaky but clear, and it was signed by someone named Dr. James Whitmore, professor of geology at Montana State University. Dr. Whitmore explained that he had been researching the bridge's construction for a historical survey when he had discovered Klaus Weber's journal in the university archives. Intrigued by the story, he had come to examine the bridge's foundation and had made a terrifying discovery. Using ground-penetrating radar, Dr. Whitmore had confirmed that there was indeed a void in the eastern foundation, exactly where Klaus's plans indicated he had sealed the dog. But the radar had shown something else. The void was much larger than it should have been, suggesting that the foundation was not just hiding a century-old crime, but was actively deteriorating. The substandard construction that Klaus had used was finally failing, and the bridge was on the verge of catastrophic collapse. Dr. Whitmore's letter explained that he had tried to contact local authorities about the structural danger, but had been dismissed as an eccentric professor chasing ghost stories. Frustrated and knowing that lives were at stake, he had hidden his findings beneath the bridge, hoping that someone local would eventually discover them and take action. The letter was dated February 14th, exactly 3 weeks before the barking had started. Emma raced back to the house with the box, her heart pounding as she realized what this meant. The barking wasn't supernatural at all. It was the sound of the bridge's foundation slowly collapsing, creating an acoustic phenomenon that mimicked the desperate cries of Klaus Weber's long-dead dog. The metal stress of failing supports was creating vibrations that resonated through the hollow spaces in the deteriorating stonework, producing sounds that occurred at exactly the same time each night, when temperature changes put maximum stress on the weakened structure. But if Dr. Whitmore was right about the bridge's condition, then everyone who used it, including the school bus that carried a dozen local children across it every morning, the mail truck that delivered to the remote ranches, and the emergency vehicles that needed it to reach the Eastern Valley, was in mortal danger. Tom listened to his daughter's breathless explanation with growing horror, realizing that what they had thought was a supernatural mystery was actually a countdown to disaster. Tom immediately called Deputy Santos, who this time took the situation seriously when presented with Dr. Whitmore's geological survey and the architectural plans from Klaus Weber's hidden journal. Within hours, a team of structural engineers from the State Highway Department was examining the bridge, and their findings confirmed Dr. Whitmore's worst fears. The Eastern Foundation was indeed failing, held together by little more than habit and luck. The bridge could collapse at any moment, and when it did, anyone on it would plunge 30 feet into the rocky creek bed below. The evacuation and closure happened so quickly that some local residents barely had time to understand what was occurring. The bridge was barricaded within 6 hours of Emma's discovery, and by the next morning, heavy equipment was positioning to begin emergency repairs. The ghost dog, that had terrorized the valley for 3 weeks, fell silent the moment the bridge was closed to traffic, as the constant vibrations from passing vehicles had been the trigger for the acoustic phenomenon that had created the haunting barking sounds. But the story's most shocking revelation came when the engineers began excavating the Eastern Foundation to replace Klaus Weber's substandard work. Exactly where the 1887 architectural plans indicated, they found a small cavity in the stonework. Inside, wrapped in what remained of a leather collar, were the bones of a medium-sized dog, Blitz, Klaus Weber's faithful companion, who had tried so desperately to warn his master about the structural weakness that would eventually threaten lives more than a century later. Dr. James Whitmore, reached by phone at the university, was amazed to learn that his hidden message had been discovered and acted upon. He explained that historical accounts had mentioned Klaus Weber's mysterious suicide but had never connected it to any structural problems with the bridge. His geological survey had been the first scientific examination of the foundation since its construction, and the ground-penetrating radar had revealed not just the entombed dog, but extensive voids and weaknesses throughout the eastern span. The bridge reconstruction took 6 months and cost the county nearly $2 million, but engineers confirmed that without the repairs, the structure would have collapsed within weeks of Emma's discovery. The alternative route that residents had to use during construction added 40 minutes to their daily commutes, but everyone agreed it was a small price to pay for avoiding a tragedy that could have killed dozens of people. Klaus Weber's journal and Blitz's remains were turned over to the Montana Historical Society, where they became part of an exhibit about immigrant craftsmen and the challenges of frontier construction. The bridge's reconstruction incorporated modern engineering standards while preserving the historic limestone facade, and a small bronze plaque was installed commemorating both Klaus Weber's craftsmanship and Blitz's unwitting role in preventing a modern disaster. But the most lasting impact of the discovery was on the Henderson family and their neighbors. Emma became fascinated with local history and geology, eventually earning a scholarship to study engineering at Montana State University, where she worked with Dr. Whitmore on a comprehensive survey of historic bridges throughout the state. Tom and Martha found their faith in rational explanations restored, though they never forgot those 3 weeks when their peaceful valley had been haunted by the desperate cries of a dog that had been trying to save lives for more than a century. The new bridge opened on a clear October morning, with a ceremony attended by most of the valley's residents. As the first vehicles crossed the rebuilt span, Tom Henderson stood with his family, watching the smooth flow of traffic over stone that was now truly built to last. Rex, his border collie, no longer cowered on the porch at night, and the peaceful sounds of the Montana wilderness had returned to normal flowing water, calling birds, and the gentle rustle of wind through cottonwood trees. The mystery of the barking dog had been solved, but its resolution had revealed something far more profound about the connections between past and present, about how the mistakes and tragedies of one generation can echo through time to threaten another, and about how sometimes the most supernatural mysteries have the most rational explanations. In the end, Blitz had gotten his message across, not through ghostly appearances or supernatural intervention, but through the simple physics of sound and stone, water and time. Klaus Weber's guilt-ridden journal became a reminder that cutting corners in construction, no matter how desperate the circumstances, inevitably leads to tragedy. His dog's entombment was a crime born of frustration and fear, but Blitz's century-long vigil had ultimately prevented a disaster far greater than Klaus could have imagined. The bridge that was meant to connect communities had nearly become their destruction, saved only by the persistent warnings of a faithful dog whose loyalty had transcended death itself. As autumn settled over the Bighorn Valley and the first snows began to dust the distant peaks, life returned to its normal rhythms. Children rode the school bus safely across the rebuilt bridge, mail was delivered on schedule, and emergency vehicles could reach every corner of the valley without delay. The only sound that broke the nighttime silence was the natural music of running water and wind, exactly as it should be in one of Montana's most peaceful corners. The story spread throughout the region and eventually gained national attention as an example of how historical research could prevent modern tragedies. Engineering schools began using the case as a study in the importance of proper construction standards and the long-term consequences of substandard materials. But for the people who lived through those 3 weeks of mysterious barking, it remained a personal reminder that sometimes the most important warnings come from the most unexpected sources. Tom Henderson kept Klaus Weber's architectural plans framed in his study, not as a curiosity but as a reminder of the responsibility that comes with building things meant to last. Every time he looked at those carefully drawn lines and measurements, he thought about the German stonemason who had tried to balance desperation with duty, and about the dog whose warnings had been ignored for over a century before finally being heard and understood. The bridge stands today as solid as the mountains that surround it, its limestone blocks properly mortared and its foundation reinforced with modern materials that will last for generations. Traffic flows smoothly across Miller's Creek, and visitors often stop to read the bronze plaque that tells the story of Klaus, Blitz, and the mystery that saved countless lives through the simple power of sound, stone, and one teenager's curiosity about the truth behind a ghost story that turned out to be something far more remarkable than anyone had imagined. 5 years have passed since that terrifying autumn when the phantom barking haunted the Bighorn Valley, and the story has become something of a legend throughout Montana and beyond. Emma Henderson, now in her final year at Montana State University, has written her senior thesis on acoustic phenomena in deteriorating structures, directly inspired by her discovery beneath the old bridge. Her research has already led to the identification of 3 other historic bridges across the western United States where similar structural failures were creating mysterious sounds that local residents had attributed to supernatural causes. Dr. James Whitmore, whose hidden message had started the chain of events that prevented disaster, established the Weber Blitz Foundation for Historical Structure Safety, funded by a combination of state grants and private donations from people who had been moved by the story. The foundation conducts free structural assessments of historic bridges and buildings throughout rural America, using modern technology to identify hidden dangers in structures built with outdated methods or compromised by decades of environmental stress. Tom Henderson often reflects on how close his community came to tragedy, and how easily the warning signs could have been dismissed or ignored. The school bus that carried 12 children across that bridge every morning had been just weeks away from a catastrophic plunge into Miller's Creek. The mail truck, the emergency vehicles, the countless residents who crossed daily without a second thought, all had been living on borrowed time, protected only by the stubborn integrity of century-old limestone and the increasingly desperate acoustic warnings of a structural failure that grew more critical with each passing day. The psychological impact of those 3 weeks lingered long after the rational explanation had been accepted. Martha Henderson still occasionally wakes at 11:43, her body remembering the nightly terror even though her mind knows the danger has passed. Rex, the border collie who had cowered in fear during those haunted nights, developed an uncanny ability to detect structural problems in buildings, often refusing to enter barns or sheds that later proved to have foundation issues or weakened support beams. The story attracted attention from paranormal investigators, structural engineers, historians, and journalists from across the country. Most came expecting to debunk a ghost story or validate supernatural claims, but instead found themselves fascinated by the complex interplay of human psychology, acoustic physics, and historical tragedy that had created such a compelling mystery. The rational explanation proved far more interesting than any supernatural alternative, demonstrating how science and history could combine to create phenomena that seemed impossible until properly understood. Klaus Weber's journal, now preserved in climate-controlled archives at the Montana Historical Society, continues to provide insights into the challenges faced by immigrant craftsmen in the late 19th century. His story has become a case study in construction ethics, used in engineering programs to illustrate how desperation and fear can lead to decisions that echo through generations. The guilt and remorse evident in his final entries serve as a powerful reminder that the consequences of cutting corners in critical infrastructure extend far beyond the immediate project. Blitz's remains were buried in a small ceremony attended by the Henderson family and several local residents who had lived through the mysterious barking. The grave marker, a simple stone carved with his name and the dates of his life, sits in a quiet corner of the old Riverside Cemetery, overlooking the valley where his warnings finally saved the lives his master's shortcuts had endangered. Local children often leave small toys and treats at the grave, having heard the story of the loyal dog whose century-long vigil prevented a modern disaster. The rebuilt bridge has become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in the intersection of history, engineering, and mystery. The bronze plaque draws hundreds of visitors each year, many of whom walk to the center of the span and listen carefully to the sounds below, the normal, natural flow of water over stone, unmarked by the desperate acoustic warnings that once echoed from the failing foundation. The silence is peaceful now, the silence of a structure built properly and safely, designed to serve the community for centuries to come. Perhaps the most profound impact of the discovery was the reminder it provided about the importance of listening to warnings, whether they come from faithful animals, concerned scientists, or the physical world itself. Klaus Weber had ignored Blitz's desperate attempts to alert him to structural problems, and Dr. Whitmore's scientific warnings had initially been dismissed by local authorities. Only when the evidence became impossible to ignore did the community act, and only Emma Henderson's curiosity and courage had prevented that action from coming too late. The story of the barking dog of Miller's Creek Bridge stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of scientific inquiry, and the unexpected ways that past and present can intersect to create both mystery and revelation. In a world increasingly skeptical of both supernatural claims and scientific expertise, it offers a middle path, a recognition that the most extraordinary stories often have the most ordinary explanations, and that the truth, when finally revealed, can be far more fascinating than any fiction we might construct to explain the unexplained sounds that sometimes echo through the darkness of a Montana night.